The steering wheel talked to my hands in a way words never could. At just over 80 miles per hour across the jagged, sun-baked washboard dirt trails of the California coast, the chromoly steel tube chassis of the prototype Desert Runner absorbed the brutal impact of the unforgiving terrain. I kept my eyes locked on the hazy horizon line, letting my fingers make microscopic, instinctual adjustments to the steering column. The 40-inch off-road tires dug ruthlessly into the loose sand and crushed granite, throwing a thick, blinding white rooster tail of dust high into the dry afternoon air behind me. Approaching a sharp, off-camber corner, I rapidly downshifted. The sequential transmission whined in loud mechanical protest, the gear teeth meshing violently as engine braking slowed the 2-ton chassis. I pitched the truck sideways into the sweeping hairpin turn, the outer edge of the trail bordering a sheer, 300-foot coastal cliff. The rear end broke loose instantly, floating dangerously over the precipice of the drop, hovering in a state of controlled chaos before the locking differentials finally caught traction and launched the vehicle forward toward the next straightaway. Hitting the brake pedal at the designated GPS checkpoint, I felt the specialized ceramic brake pads bite hard into the slotted steel rotors. The truck slid to a protesting halt in a cloud of settling white dust. I reached up to the overhead console and hit the master electrical kill switch. The sudden, absolute silence ringing in the cab was deafening. The dual electric cooling fans hummed steadily against the aluminum radiator, attempting to pull the extreme heat from the engine bay. The sharp, distinct smell of hot metal, vaporized high-octane racing fuel, and scorched sagebrush immediately filled the cramped, confined space of the steel roll cage. I unbuckled the latch of my 5-point safety harness, letting the rigid nylon straps fall away from my chest and shoulders. Pushing the thick door open, I stepped out onto the baked dirt. The coastal wind cut through my sweat-soaked, multi-layer fire suit, cooling the damp fabric against my skin. The radio clipped securely to my chest harness cracked loudly, spitting a burst of static into the quiet air. Base camp to Unit 1. Azrael. Do you copy? I unclipped the black microphone, pressing the rubber transmission button with my thumb. Unit 1. I copy. Mateo. The rebound damping on the rear left bypass shock is running entirely too hot. It's bottoming out on the deep whoops. The valving isn't keeping up with the fluid displacement. Copy that on the suspension data. Mateo's voice came back, sounding unusually strained over the secured frequency. But we have a much bigger logistical issue down here. Macy took the diesel support rig up the North Ridge Trail an hour ago to manually place the remote telemetry repeaters. She just radioed Jessa in operations on the emergency channel. She blew a front axle on a rock step. The rig is high-centered, completely dead in the water, and the afternoon tide is starting to cut off the lower access road. You're the closest active asset on the grid. My jaw tightened instinctively. Macy Watson ran the entire telemetry spine for this prototype division. If she failed to transmit clean, uninterrupted data to the corporate server today, the board of directors pulled our funding package tomorrow morning. She belonged in the climate-controlled command trailer, analyzing complex streams of hexadecimal code, not wrestling a 3-ton utility truck up a Class 5 rock-crawling trail meant for specifically modified vehicles. Understood, I said, sliding my helmet back on and climbing into the driver's seat of the prototype. I'm tracking her emergency beacon signal on my dash monitor now. ETA is 15 minutes. Firing the engine, the 8-cylinder block roared to life, shaking the frame of the truck. I threw the shifter into gear and slammed the accelerator pedal down to the floorboard, aiming the blunt nose of the prototype directly toward the steep, jagged incline of the North Ridge Trail. The terrain worsened immediately. The packed, relatively smooth coastal sand quickly gave way to angular granite boulders that threatened to tear the fragile oil pan right out of the chassis. Dropping the transfer case into low gear, I crawled the machine over the rocks with deliberate, surgical precision. I listened closely as the 1/4-inch aluminum skid plates scraped and ground against the unyielding stone. At the top of a punishing, 30-degree incline, overlooking the churning, dark gray water of the Pacific Ocean, I found her. The support rig was pitched at a terrifying, precarious angle. Its front right tire had completely sheared off the axle housing, leaving the raw, jagged metal resting dead on the peak of a granite boulder. Macy stood outside the stranded vehicle, the harsh coastal wind whipping her dark hair violently around the high collar of her neon yellow high-visibility jacket. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't calling for help on the radio. Instead, she was holding a 4-foot steel pry bar, attempting to manually wedge the thick metal under the crushed lower control arm to gain leverage. I parked the prototype on the flat shelf of rock 20 yards away and firmly engaged the electronic parking brake. Grabbing my canvas recovery bag from the rear cargo rack, I stepped out into the wind. After the prototype 2020 drop the bar, I called out, my voice carrying sharply over the rhythmic sound of the crashing waves hundreds of feet below. You aren't going to move 3 tons of dead weight with leverage. If that steel slips under pressure, the kinetic energy is going to snap back and break your jaw. Macy stopped pushing immediately. Letting the steel bar fall safely into the dirt with a dull thud, she wiped a thick smear of black axle grease across her cheek with the back of her leather work glove. The differential housing cracked on the ascent, she explained, pointing a gloved finger to the jagged, leaking split in the cast iron metal. I lost 4-wheel drive engagement, the rig slid backward on the loose shale, and the control arm caught the granite step. The truck is completely stuck. Walking up to the damaged vehicle, I crouched down in the dirt to closely inspect the undercarriage. The damage was absolutely terminal for the front suspension geometry. The entire passenger side of the truck was resting dead on the rock, pinning the drivetrain. "Why are you out here in the first place, Macy?" I asked, pulling a thick braided synthetic kinetic recovery rope and 2 steel D-ring shackles from my canvas bag. Mateo was explicitly scheduled to plant the remote repeaters this morning. Macy crossed her arms tightly over her chest, defending against the wind. Marcus decided to restructure the engineering assignments at dawn, without consulting me. He pulled Mateo off the repeater detail and ordered him to audit the shop's hardware inventory. If those physical repeaters weren't planted on this ridge by noon, Marcus was going to officially flag my division to the corporate board for missing a critical project milestone. Marcus was the corporate PM, the one who controlled the investor reporting line, and he wanted Macy's budget and title. If he marked the upload as incomplete, the corporate server would auto-freeze the file until a board-side audit cleared it after the funding window closed. It was a calculated, bureaucratic assassination attempt on her career. "I'll handle Marcus when we get back," I stated, walking purposefully to the front of my prototype. I disengaged the clutch on the front electric winch and unspooled 50 feet of steel cable. "Stand behind the prototype. Stay completely clear of the tension line." Dragging the steel hook over the rocks to her wrecked rig, I located the reinforced, welded toe point on the steel front bumper. I threaded the pin of the D-ring through the eyelet, tightened it down completely with my fingers, and then deliberately backed it off a quarter turn so the threads wouldn't permanently bind under the extreme pulling pressure. "The rock is acting as an anchor point against the chassis," I told her, picking up the wired winch controller and walking back to my driver's side door. "If I pull you straight back, the angle will rip the entire bumper assembly off the frame. I have to pull you laterally off the side of the boulder first, then drag the rig backwards onto the flat shelf." Climbing into the cab of my prototype, I put the transmission into reverse, keeping my foot firmly planted on the hydraulic brake to act as a solid, immovable anchor. I hit the IN button on the controller. The electric winch whined loudly, quickly taking up the slack in the line. The synthetic cable pulled completely taut, vibrating intensely like a tuned guitar string under the immense strain. I monitored the tension closely, watching the angle of the strap. Slowly, agonizingly, the metal frame of the support rig groaned. Crushed steel scraped violently against solid granite. With a loud, echoing thud, the crippled rig slid laterally off the rock and slammed down into the dirt, all 4 wheels resting safely on relatively flat ground. I spooled the steel cable back into the drum, unhooked the shackles, and threw the canvas recovery bag into the bed of my truck. "I'll have Mateo bring the flatbed tow truck up the wider access road from the north side of the ridge to recover it. Grab your data pad. You're riding back down the mountain with me." Macy didn't argue. She retrieved her black Pelican case containing the active telemetry nodes from the cab of her ruined truck and climbed gracefully into the passenger side of my vehicle. She reached for the complex, 5-point racing harness, pulling the nylon straps over her shoulders. "Let me check the tension," I said quietly, leaning slightly over the center carbon fiber console. I checked the precise alignment of the straps across her collarbones, clicking the interlocking metal buckles into the central rotary cam. I cinched the lower lap strap snug against her waist, verifying the locking mechanism was completely secure against the violent G-forces we would experience on the descent. She gave a short, professional nod of confirmation when the harness locked tight. I cinched the straps one last time, then pulled my hands back like the line was live, placing them firmly on the steering wheel. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and calm over the low, vibrating hum of the idling engine. I didn't answer with unnecessary words. I put the sequential transmission in gear and started the long, jarring descent back to the base camp, watching the dark clouds gathering over the ocean horizon. Halfway down the treacherous trail, navigating a deeply rutted section of dried mud, she reached into her bag and pulled out a half-empty plastic water bottle. "Drink," she instructed. I kept my eyes on the trail, my hands gripping the suede wheel. I didn't reach for it immediately. She tapped the bottle against my forearm again once until I took it. "You're not allowed to pass out on my data," she said, her voice dry as a torque spec. I lifted my visor slightly. The cold water cut sharply through the thick layer of dust coating my throat, instantly settling my elevated pulse. I handed the bottle back, and we rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. The main operating garage was a corrugated steel airplane hangar sitting on the flat edge of the coastal basin. The vast interior was lit by rows of harsh, buzzing industrial halogens, and the air smelled intensely of fresh welding gas, ozone, and old motor oil. Jessa, the corporate safety and investor liaison, was standing strictly by the main diagnostic computer monitors, her metal clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. Matteo waited near the hydraulic vehicle lift, wiping his hands on a rag. Parking the dust-covered prototype precisely over the concrete inspection pit, I hit the kill switch and killed the engine. Before either of us could unbuckle our harnesses, Marcus walked out of the climate-controlled, glass-walled office at the back of the hangar. He wore a crisp, expensive button-down shirt that looked entirely ridiculous against the rugged backdrop of grease and dirt. He was holding a digital tablet, his face set in a hard, manufactured line of corporate disappointment. 3 hours? Marcus announced loudly, stopping at the edge of the inspection pit. He looked directly at Massey as she unlatched her cam and climbed out of the roll cage. "The primary support rig is completely unaccounted for. The telemetry network is operating at only 60% capacity. And you just wasted our lead driver's critical track time for an unapproved rescue mission. Jessa is documenting all of this? It's exactly the logistical failure I explicitly warned the investors about during the quarterly review." Jessa looked up from her clipboard, her expression flat. "The network is actually showing green, Marcus," she corrected, her tone perfectly neutral and objective. "The remote repeaters came online 10 minutes ago, but the timeline is severely compromised. The final stress test run has to happen tomorrow morning before the coastal storm hits the peninsula." Macy stood up entirely straight. She didn't shrink under his authority. The front axle suffered a catastrophic stress fracture due to a pre-existing microflaw in the factory casting. "It wasn't a logistical failure, Marcus. It was an equipment failure. The board of directors doesn't care about the mechanical difference," Marcus countered, tapping his screen aggressively with his index finger. "If we don't have a flawlessly executed, high-speed stress test run recorded and uploaded to the server by tomorrow evening, they pull the operational funding. And I will officially recommend they dissolve your entire telemetry division for gross incompetence." Stepping out of the driver's side of the truck, the thud of my boots echoed loudly against the concrete floor. I walked around the sloping hood of the prototype, placing my physical frame squarely between Marcus and the passenger door where Macy stood. "The support rig failed because you arbitrarily reassigned my chief mechanic to count plastic zip ties instead of completing his mandatory morning vehicle inspections," I said, my voice a low, steady gravel that cut through the cavernous room. If Matteo had put that rig on the lift this morning as scheduled, he would have caught the hairline fracture in the metal casting before she ever left the pavement. "You caused the failure, Marcus. It's time-stamped in the digital maintenance log." Marcus shifted his weight defensively, his eyes narrowing. "You're just a driver, Azrael. Stick to the steering wheel and the gas pedal. This is a senior management issue. It becomes my personal issue when my team is stranded on the edge of a cliff," I stated, staring him down without blinking, my posture completely unyielding. The telemetry repeaters are fully active. I checked the signal strength on my localized dash monitor while I was winching her truck out of the rocks. Now get out of my garage. I have to completely rebuild a complex bypass shock before the sun comes up tomorrow. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, saw the absolute physical finality in my posture, and tightly snapped his jaw shut. He turned sharply on his heel and walked rapidly back toward the safety of the glass office. Jessa made a final, decisive note on her clipboard. You have until exactly noon tomorrow to ping the satellite from the summit of the spine, she warned us plainly, her voice carrying no malice. Only fact. If the data drops for even a second, Marcus signs the dissolution papers and the project is dead. The hangar went quietly still as Jessa walked away toward the server racks. Mateo silently slipped out the side bay door to go fetch the wrecked rig with the flatbed. Macy let out a long, incredibly heavy breath, leaning her back against the cold, scarred metal of the primary workbench. The deep lines of stress were clearly etched around her dark eyes. You didn't have to do that, she said, looking at the floor. He's going to put a target on your back now, too. I don't care about corporate targets or boardroom politics, I replied, grabbing a rolling floor jack and sliding it smoothly under the rear axle of the prototype. I care about the machine, and I care about the data being accurate. I aggressively pumped the steel handle of the jack, lifting the rear tire completely off the ground. I grabbed a pneumatic impact wrench and started removing the lug nuts, the rapid-fire mechanical hammering filling the empty space. Azrael, Macy said, raising her voice to be heard over the loud mechanical noise. I released the trigger, stopping the wrench. What? Tomorrow is the final, definitive stress test on the devil's spine, she said, referencing the most brutal, dangerously unpredictable 70-mile stretch of coastal mountain terrain on the topographical map. Marcus is going to try to stall the data packet remotely if there are any minute drops in the signal. The only way to ensure the file is completely clean and securely locked behind the firewall is if I manually monitor the main hard drive connection locally from inside the vehicle. I set the floor jack handle down. No, I have to ride in the navigator seat, she insisted, taking a step toward the truck. The Devil's Spine isn't a graded dirt road. It's a high-speed endurance track full of blind, off-camber crests, washed-out ravines, and sheer vertical drops, I argued, my voice hardening. I'm not taking you down a cliff with me. I weigh 130 pounds, Macy countered, her voice rising with undeniable professional authority. You can adjust the coil-over preload collars to compensate for the dynamic weight shift. If I am not explicitly in that cab, Marcus will corrupt the upload. I am riding with you. My thumb checked the harness latch on the seat again once, twice, until the click felt real and undeniable. I needed the cab empty to focus. But she needed to be there to protect the work. I'm a lead field engineer, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, completely steady tone that demanded absolute respect. I'm asking you to do your job and let me do mine. Setting the tool down on the concrete, I turned around to face her. She was standing her ground, refusing to shrink from the environment or my resistance. 6A. M, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. Wear a fire suit, and don't touch the radio comms while I'm driving. Macy nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. 6A. M. By 2 a.m., the shocks were rebuilt. I counted collar turns in the halogen glare until the numbers stopped arguing with my gut. Wiping the tools down with a rag, I left a single light on in the corner of the hangar and slept for 3 restless hours on a stiff canvas cot in the back room. The next morning, the sky over the California coast was an angry, bruised, charcoal gray. The heavy marine layer had pushed deep inland overnight, bringing a thick, impenetrable fog and the imminent threat of severe rain. Macy arrived at the garage at exactly 5:45 a.m., wearing a professionally rated black Nomex fire suit. Her dark hair was tied back tightly and secured at the nape of her neck. She carried a highly specialized, ruggedized laptop and a thick bundle of braided data cables. Jess's voice crackled loudly over the base station radio before we even managed to buckle in. Radio check at mile 10. Do not miss the window. Unit 1. Jessa instructed over the channel, her tone strictly business. I need to officially log your progress in the system before Marcus tries to pull the plug and scrub the run early. Copy, I said into the helmet mic. Mateo topped off the fuel cell with high-octane racing fuel. "Storm warning just officially upgraded," he said, tapping the fiberglass fender with his knuckles. "Low-pressure system. You're going to have incredibly deep mud on the spine." "We run it anyway," I replied, checking the tire pressure on the digital gauge, manually bleeding them down to 18 psi for maximum surface traction on wet, slick rock. I climbed into the driver's seat. Macy climbed into the passenger side. My thumb checked my own harness latch again, once, twice. I reached over, plugging her helmet intercom cable securely into the dashboard comms unit. "Com check," I said, my voice feeding directly into her earpiece. "Loud and clear," she replied, her hands already flying across the illuminated keyboard of her laptop, syncing the raw data feed to the vehicle's ECU. Firing the engine, I dropped the transmission into gear and rolled out of the hangar, pointing the nose of the prototype directly toward the dark silhouette of the coastal mountains. The first 20 miles were a high-speed, adrenaline-fueled blur. The machine absorbed the deep, brutal washouts effortlessly. Macy sat perfectly still, her eyes locked intensely on the rapid, scrolling lines of code. The severe rain started at mile 25. A solid, violent, unrelenting wall of water dropped from the sky, instantly turning the hard-packed dirt trail into a slick, treacherous river of thick brown mud. Engaging the four-wheel drive system with a clunk, I felt the steering immediately become heavy, fighting the deep, water-filled ruts that threatened to pull the tires off the path. "We're entering the spine," I said over the comms, my hands gripping the wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. 100-foot drop on the right. "Keep your RPMs up," Macy replied calmly, her voice an anchor in the noise. "I'm actively monitoring the wheel slip sensors. I'll dial back the engine torque mapping to keep you from spinning out on the clay." Hitting a steep, highly off-camber incline completely covered in slick clay, the truck started to slide laterally toward the unprotected edge of the cliff. I aggressively countersteered, hunting desperately for the jagged bedrock underneath the thick mud. Suddenly, a loud, violent metallic bang echoed from the front end of the chassis. The steering wheel jerked to the left, nearly ripping my thumbs from the suede grip. Slamming both feet entirely on the brake pedal, the truck slid uncontrollably for 10 terrifying feet before coming to a dead, sudden stop. The right front tire hovered just inches from the sheer, terrifying drop-off into the misty canyon below. "Talk to me!" Macy yelled over the intercom comms, her hands bracing hard against the carbon fiber dashboard. "We lost steering," I grunted, throwing the transmission forcefully into park. "Stay in the cab." Opening the door, I stepped out into the pouring rain. The thick mud instantly coated my boots up to the ankles. I knelt directly in the freezing, brown sludge to look closely under the front bumper. The 1-inch thick solid steel tie rod had completely snapped in half from the sheer lateral force of a hidden rock strike. The passenger side tire was pigeon-toed outward, completely disconnected from the steering rack. I pulled myself back up, the freezing rain completely soaking through my fire suit. I opened the passenger door. Tie rod snapped. "We can't steer." Macy looked at the red digital clock on her dashboard monitor. "It's 8 a.m. The upload window closes completely at noon. I looked at the canvas tool bag securely strapped to the rear rack. I didn't have a spare custom tie rod, but I absolutely refused to let her lose this project. "Macy," I said over the intercom, keeping my voice completely level, "I need you to climb into the driver's seat. Can you hold the brake pedal completely to the floor while I get underneath the suspension?" She gave a sharp, immediate nod and quickly unbuckled, sliding gracefully over the center console. Unstrapping the tool bag and a thick, heavy-duty yellow ratchet strap used for securing cargo, I crawled directly under the front of the truck. Lying flat on my back in 3 inches of freezing mud, I forcefully pulled the two broken, jagged halves of the thick steel tie rod together. I grabbed a forged steel wrench handle, laying it flat across the brake like a rigid medical splint. Threading the thick yellow ratchet strap around the steel components, I looped it tightly and began aggressively cranking the metal ratchet mechanism. The nylon strap groaned loudly under the immense pressure, firmly compressing the broken steel rod against the wrench handle. Crawling out from under the truck, completely covered in thick brown sludge, I stood up and wiped the water from my visor. "Will it hold?" Macy asked from the open door, the rain lashing against her helmet. It wasn't steering, just a crude way to keep the wheel from free-floating long enough to crawl to the summit. I explained, climbing back into the driver's seat as she slid back over to the passenger side. We have 40 miles of trail left. We have to keep the speed strictly under 20 miles an hour and let the rock dictate the path. For the next 3 brutal hours, it was an agonizing, nerve-wracking test of endurance. I babied the steering wheel, fighting the terrifying looseness in the front end, feeling every single rock strike reverberate through the broken strap. Macy sat beside me, her eyes darting rapidly between her laptop screen and the obscured trail ahead. She called out the severe terrain changes, using her topographical radar map to warn me of deadly drop-offs completely hidden by the heavy coastal fog. "Hard left in 50 feet, she commanded, her voice perfectly steady. "The trail completely washes out on the right edge." I didn't look at the GPS map once. I drove off her verbal callouts like they were physical traction on the wet rock. At 11:30 a.m., the heavy rain clouds finally broke. We crawled the crippled, mud-caked prototype over the final rocky crest. Reaching the flat concrete pad of the summit peak, I hit the brakes and threw the truck into park. Macy's hands flew frantically across her illuminated keyboard, establishing connection to the localized satellite uplink, uploading telemetry packet. 80%. 90. A sharp, digital beep sounded brightly in the cab. "Upload complete," Macy said, leaning back heavily into her racing seat, her chest heaving. "Data is absolutely clean. File locked and secured on the corporate server." I finally let go of the steering wheel. My knuckles were completely white inside my gloves. "You strapped a broken steering column together with a nylon cargo strap in the middle of a mudslide?" she said quietly, acknowledging the absolute insanity of the feat. "It held," I said, my voice a rough, exhausted rasp. Macy turned in the bucket seat to face me completely. "Marcus called me on the satellite phone while you were under the truck. He ordered me to immediately abandon the vehicle and let the data fail." I turned my head sharply. "And?" "I told him the lead driver determined the vehicle was operable," Macy said, her gaze completely unwavering. Her badge wasn't just engineering, she owned the telemetry keys. She could revoke remote access in an emergency, and this was one. I locked him out of the node completely. She had staked her entire department, her funding, and her career on a yellow ratchet strap, and my word. She tapped my glove once, then went straight back to shutting down the uplink. "Let's go home," she said. That evening, the steel doors of the main hangar were thrown wide open to the cool coastal air. The engineering team had gathered around a makeshift folding table covered entirely in grease-stained pizza boxes. The prototype was parked squarely on the alignment rack, caked in 50 pounds of dried mud, the yellow cargo strap still wrapped tightly around the steering column like a badge of honor. Matteo walked by, holding a paper plate. He shoved a slice of pizza into my hand like a tool. "Eat. You drive better when you're not running on fumes." I took a bite, the hot cheese burning the roof of my mouth, and nodded my thanks. Jessa stood near the glass office, holding her tablet. She caught my eye and walked over, the tension finally gone from her shoulders. The investors reviewed the entire packet. "It's flawless. The spring funding is officially secured, and the confirmation email just hit the main server." "And Marcus?" I asked. "Requested a permanent transfer to the Chicago office. Submitted the paperwork 10 minutes ago," Jessa replied, tapping her screen twice before walking back to the command desk. Macy walked through the center of the loud hangar, having changed into clean denim jeans and a simple gray sweater. She walked straight past the food, directly over to where I was standing in the deep shadows of the machinery. She stood beside me, holding a manila folder and a silver pen. "The board asked me to formally designate a permanent lead test driver for the next 3 years," she said, her voice easily cutting through the surrounding noise. Jessa printed the liability waivers. "They need a signature tonight." My fingers stopped searching for my truck keys. The hangar noise kept moving, people laughing and drinking, but my boots stayed planted right where the rear tire met the concrete. "I'm afraid of getting hurt again," she said, her voice dropping underneath the noise, offering a rare, unguarded truth. "Marcus nearly wrecked my division, and every driver I've hired has bailed when the contracts got difficult or dangerous." I signed the paper. Then I slid the folder back into her hands like it was a shared tool, not a verdict. She slid a second page forward, a freshly printed corporate crew roster. My name sat permanently under the bold heading Lead Test Driver. Her signature was already wet ink beside it. No speeches, Just a schedule that finally included home as a destination. Jessa walked past us on her way to the office, catching sight of the dual signatures on the fender, and gave a single, verifying nod before tapping her clipboard. Leaning back against the cold steel of the chassis, I listened to the steady hum of the cooling fans and looked down at the bright yellow strap holding the front end together. I just stood there, smelling the lingering scent of damp earth and welding gas, finally letting the noise of the room wash past me. Real strength showed up as a clean upload, a working strap, and someone who didn't leave when the rain got loud. Real partnership isn't built in the easy moments. It's forged in the dirt, through consistency and the choice to stay when leaving is easier. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.